Good evening. I see we have some attendees that are coming in. We're going to give ourselves a few minutes, as we do every time, to make sure that those who have registered have a chance to log in, and then we will get started. Welcome, everyone. We're going to give everybody a few minutes to get logged in, and then we will get started in just a couple minutes. Thank you. We've got a good number of attendees that have joined us. We're going to give one more minute and then we will get started. Thanks. Okay, welcome everyone. As a preliminary matter, we have Spanish interpretation available this evening. If you'll look at the bottom of your screen and where you see the chat button, there's also an interpreter button. It looks like a globe with a grid. You just need to press on that and select English or Spanish, and we'll have that translated. Rosario? Okay. Rosario, are you there?
Rosario, you will have to come to the English channel. We can't hear you.
Okay, as we had at the previous one, if you just look at the bottom at where you see the globe and select English or Spanish, the translation will be made for you as we are speaking. So we are going to get started. Good evening and welcome. My name is Mary Catherine Gibbs. I'm the land use attorney for HRP, the owners of the Potomac River Generating Station site. I want to welcome you all to what is the 8th community engagement event that HRP has organized to discuss the redevelopment of the Potomac River Generating Station in Old Town North. Before we begin, there are a few items we want to review to assure that everyone is comfortable using Zoom. Audience members, please note you're both muted on audio and camera. We do this to ensure that we're able to efficiently review the materials and answer all your questions. If you're interested in asking questions or making comments, we ask that you either submit those through the Q&A function you should be seeing at the bottom of your screen, or raise your hand in the question and answer period that will take place after we finished our presentation, and you'll be able to ask your questions verbally. We do ask that people who are asking questions verbally do so in a respectful time frame and manner so that as many people as possible get the opportunity to have their questions and comments addressed. We'll try to log all your questions on our end. That chat box function will not work. We will be gathering questions received during the meeting and will answer as many as we can during the question and answer session. Any questions we're unable to cover in the time we've allotted for tonight's meeting will be saved so we can provide written answers to all and post them on our website in a couple of weeks. We're also recording this meeting, and we will post a recording of this meeting on our website as well. For those of you who are joining us by phone, you can send your questions and comments to the email that was in the chat, hrpinfo@hilcoglobal.com. We'll do our best to check the email to ask and answer these questions during the meeting. If we're not able to answer your question during the meeting due to time limitations, we will share the answer along with all questions asked at our website, www.hrpalx.com, where the answers to all questions asked during the community meetings are posted. We're here to listen to your comments and answer your questions to the greatest extent we can. We'll be covering a lot of information and we'll leave plenty of time for questions, and we can always go back to a slide during questions and answers if you'd like. Again, thank you all for being here tonight, and we'll go ahead and get started. Next slide. Here's our agenda tonight. As has been true of all of our community engagement events as part of this process, HRP wants to assure everyone that there's plenty of opportunity for community participation. We're committed to working together. Tonight, we're going to discuss environmental remediation and sustainability. We'll start by a brief introduction of our plans, and then we'll discuss environmental remediation and site prep first, and then sustainability, with plenty of time for questions. Next slide. So you've seen this before if you've attended some of our prior meetings, but we've had multiple events to engage with the community even before we submitted our CDD concept plan to the city at the end of July of 2021. That's where the light gray on the left ends. As we discussed at our past meetings, we've submitted our second CDD concept plan in December, and along with responses to the city's comments on that first submission. We've received comments back from the city on that CDD2 submission, and we're working through those and plan on making what's called a completeness submission very shortly. This is our 8th community meeting, and as I said previously, it will focus on environmental remediation and sustainability. We have other upcoming community meetings that I'll get to on the next slide. All of these submissions and topical meetings will be moving us towards public hearings on the CDD concept plan at the end of June and early July of 2022. Next slide. We continue to think it's really important to demonstrate the level of outreach and community engagement that has occurred so far and what is still forthcoming. We started almost a year ago with our first meeting in February of 2021. This is a big project and it deserves significant discussion and input from the many stakeholders, including you. So far, we've held over 20 meetings with the community, the city staff, and the National Park Service, and we'll be having more. What's important to note is in the first 2 columns, the number of meetings we've had with stakeholders between the first and the second submission. Significant input has been solicited and has helped this process move forward. The highlighted items reflect what is coming up. We will have our next community meeting on transportation, and that meeting date has been scheduled for March 31st. We will also be having several other meetings that have been highlighted with important groups like Notice, the Old Town North Alliance, the Urban Design Advisory Committee, which is called UDAC, the Alexandria Housing Affordability Advisory Committee, AHAC, and the Environmental Policy Commission, as well as other meetings that you see on this slide here. We are working hard to continue to solicit your input and input from a range of stakeholders in Alexandria in general, and more importantly, in Old Town North. Now I'd like to turn it over to Melissa Schrock of HRP.
Thanks, Mary Catherine. Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Melissa Schrock, and I lead the mixed-use development team at Hilco Redevelopment Partners. We really appreciate all the great opportunities that we've had over the past year to meet with the community, city staff, and leadership as we develop the vision for the redevelopment of PRGS. Of course, the CDD stage that we're in right now is still very, very early in the overall process of redeveloping a site like PRGS with all of its complexity. But commercial real estate projects typically deliver a variety of mitigations to offset their impacts like storm water and traffic impacts, and also a variety of public benefits so that the community and the municipality can share in the value that's created through redevelopment. We thought it would be helpful to provide some very early information on both the scope and the costs of those benefits and mitigations, and that's what you see here on this slide. This isn't intended to be a definitive list, and these certainly are not the final costs. Many are yet to be filled in, as you can see. But we believe in having a transparent dialogue with the community. And so we thought it was important to share our early details and estimates with you. First and foremost, the PRGS site, as you know, operated as a coal-fired power plant for over 70 years and was shuttered about 10 years ago, thanks to the advocacy of Alexandrians. It will require significant above and below grade remediation, as well as deconstruction of the existing facility in order to enable the land to be redeveloped for its future uses. My colleagues, Juliana Connolly and Joe Duray, will be giving you an overview of the below grade remediation process tonight. Our early projections indicate costs of at least $60 million for that work, and we'll be refining that number as we begin to bid the abatement and deconstruction work. Of course, we won't be rebuilding a power plant, and the future buildings will be designed with sustainable strategies and systems. This is the other topic for tonight's meeting that Mike Babcock from Sustainable Building Partners will dive into, our consultant on the project. While we haven't begun actual building design yet, and we don't know all of the associated cost premiums, we are working on a carbon neutrality analysis, and we'll be submitting a sustainability master plan with our infrastructure DSUP later this spring. These documents will be a framework for future development decisions and will guide the project in relation to the city's sustainability goals that are laid out in the Old Town North Small Area Plan and the Environmental Action Plan. There are a number of public realm benefits associated with the project, which if you've attended our past meetings, you've probably seen a lot of. A lot of that is about open space, but the project also extends the Old Town North Arts and Cultural Corridor into the site, providing on-site arts uses. And there will also be over 5 acres of public open space provided on-site. And the improvements made to that and to the existing and future abutting parkland will come with an estimated cost of between $30 and $35 million. Lastly, on this column here, the project made the early commitment to build the vast majority of the parking below grade, which creates a much better pedestrian experience and allows for street level activation. It does come with a pretty significant price tag, which we currently estimate to be approximately $150 million across the entire project. Up on the next column, in terms of affordable housing, our team is currently working with the Office of Housing to develop an affordable housing plan, and we've submitted a draft in early February. As discussed at our last community meeting on February 24th, at a minimum, that plan will involve a voluntary contribution of approximately $7.5 to $11.4 million, depending on the final mix of uses that actually gets developed on the site. We're also applying for about 350,000 square feet of bonus density, as we discussed in that last meeting. And that density is available under the Arts and Cultural District and also the affordable housing density bonuses that are available in Old Town North. We've proposed that any bonus density achieved be divided evenly between affordable housing and the arts and cultural bonus. And a third of that affordable housing bonus density will be delivered as on-site units. As we're, excuse me, we are also discussing the opportunity for public-private partnerships with the Office of Housing to find additional ways to create on-site affordable units. We understand that this is a priority for Alexandrians, and we will have more details to share as we advance through the development process. On the transportation front, the project will deliver a number of new roadways, reconnecting the PRGS site, which has really been an island in the city, into the surrounding Old Town North neighborhood. Additionally, our team is preparing a multimodal transportation study as part of this CDD process. This study will include a number of recommendations for transportation improvements in order to mitigate the impacts of the project and to improve the transportation network that exists in the neighborhood. The exact improvements to be implemented and their phasing will be determined in the future infrastructure DSUP process. So we don't have the specific details or the costs on those yet, but we will be providing them as the project moves forward. As Mary Catherine mentioned, our next community meeting on March 31st will go into detail on the multimodal transportation study itself. So please join us for that. And lastly, on the economic development front, we estimate that the project will create approximately 1,100 construction-related jobs over a potential 10-year construction period, and nearly 3,000 permanent jobs, in addition to significant tax dollars for the city of Alexandria, both during the construction period and upon completion, when annual tax revenue is projected to be approximately $34 million. All of these numbers are early estimates, and they're in today's 2022 dollars. So we will continue to share updates with you as we get them. Next slide, please. If you've attended any of our other community meetings or our site tours that we did in June and November, if you've attended any of those, you're probably familiar with this slide. Over the past year, we've had many, many conversations with the local community, with city staff, and with city leaders, and that's helped inform our approach to the PRGS project. Through these conversations, we developed 3 primary design drivers that synthesize what we've heard as we think about the physical site planning of PRGS. You can see those 3 principles here, and I'll turn it over now to my colleague, Michelle Chang, who's going to touch on each of them briefly before we turn to tonight's main topics. Michelle?
Thanks, Melissa. My name is Michelle Chang, as Melissa said. I'm Vice President of Mixed Use at HRP, and I'm going to run through the 3 guiding principles quickly for anyone that hasn't joined our previous community meetings or would like a refresher. So I'll start with the next slide, which is our first principle is to integrate the site. It's so the site is located on the edge of Old Town North, and it's critical to our vision of a friendly, inviting, and walkable mixed-use environment to reknit the site into the surrounding neighborhoods and urban fabric. Consistent with the small area plan, we've continued the existing street networks into the site with direct connections at Slater's Lane up to the north, and down to the south, North Royal and North Fairfax streets. 2 potential future access points are located at North Pitt Street, which you can see to the south in a dotted line, and then connecting to the southwest of the current Pepco substation, there is a dotted line that leads out to East Abington. These will require cooperation with other landowners. Next slide, please. The second principle is connect people to the waterfront. We've heard from the community and the city very clearly that Alexandrians want better and more usable connections to their waterfront. We focused a lot of attention on how to improve both visual and physical connectivity to the Potomac River by orienting the roadway network in a way that shortens the physical distance to the waterfront and opens up view corridors. Next slide, please. And the third principle is to provide meaningful open space, which Melissa touched upon. It was also the topic of a November meeting for anyone who wants to go back and visit our website for more information. Basically, we're adding nearly 6 acres of on-site public open space that is seamlessly connected to existing national parks, to the National Park Service parkland, which is along the Potomac and in a light green shade, and also to a future linear park that is envisioned on the Norfolk Southern Land to the southwest and is also labeled as Norfolk Southern Land in a light green shade. All told, over 14 acres of open space will be created or unlocked for public use. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Bonnie Amrit-Kaur.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Bonnie Amrit-Kaur, and I'm the Senior Development Manager with HRP Mixed Use Development Team. I want to walk all of you through the type of projects we tackle. HRP is currently undertaking a historic transformation in Philadelphia, as you can see on the slide, turning a former oil refinery that operated for over 150 years into the Bellwether District, a 1,300-acre state-of-the-art life science and logistics campus. HRP is remediating and transforming this relic of industrial era into a green, sustainable district that will be an economic engine for all of Philadelphia. The deconstruction process involves decommissioning 26 units of refinery, 850,000 barrels of refinery product, 30,000 tons of asbestos, hundreds of ancillary buildings, and 950 running miles of pipeline. The process is about 60% complete. And on the next slide, you can see the visualization of how our approach to remediation and redevelopment of these former industrial sites, reconnecting them to surrounding communities and putting them back to productive use. So they become important community assets that promote environmental, economic, and community sustainability. Next slide, Melissa.
Thanks, Bonnie. Before Juliana and Joe dive into the topic of environmental remediation, I did just want to say a quick word on the future deconstruction process, as we know that many of our neighbors have questions about that. Could you go to the next slide? Great. While we haven't selected a contractor and we do not have a start date for the deconstruction process yet, we want you to know that once we do, we will hold public informational meetings to provide details on when we are starting, the anticipated duration, the contractors performing the work, mitigation measures that will be in place, and all of the relevant details that the public will need to know. There is a lot of planning that goes into the process, and that will involve things like developing a construction management plan per the city's requirements. We will also be establishing a rodent control plan, noise and vibration controls for the site, and as well as dust monitoring protocols. There will be a plan for worker parking in place, and we'll perform existing conditions surveys on neighboring properties that are immediately adjacent to the work. So we don't anticipate starting this work for many months, so we will be back in touch on this phase as we get closer to it. And I think the next slide is Juliana.
Thanks, Melissa. Hi, everyone. My name is Juliana Connolly, and I lead environmental remediation work for HRP here in Alexandria and throughout the country. We're going to talk tonight about the environmental assessment and remediation work that we have ongoing at the site. And what I mean by assessment is sort of the initial phases of sampling and figuring out where contamination has come to be located in the subsurface. So we'll break up that work into sort of the two processes that we're working under. One is the voluntary remediation program, the Virginia Voluntary Remediation Program, which is a program that HRP entered the site into in early 2021. So that's new work that started with our ownership. And then we'll also talk about a known petroleum release area that was known to us at the time of our acquisition. It was known to the prior owner, and remediation activities already started under the prior owner's ownership of the site, and that we're continuing during our ownership. The voluntary remediation program is what it sounds like. It's a voluntary program that property owners can choose to enter to first look for potential contamination in the subsurface, and we look in areas that we're sort of suspicious about potential contamination based on past use. After we do that sampling to look for contamination, we identify areas where remediation is necessary, and then we would implement that remediation, in this case, in coordination with the redevelopment of the site. So the first step in that voluntary remediation program, as I mentioned, is sort of looking for where the contamination might be located. We can't see the subsurface, and so that sampling is done through drilling, collection of soil and groundwater samples, and sending those samples to a laboratory for chemical analysis so we can understand what is present in the subsurface. That sampling work began last fall, and in a few minutes I'll hand over to my colleague Joe Duray, who will walk you through some of what we've found so far. One thing I just want to make sure people understand is that this sampling work that we do is an iterative process. So we'll start sampling in certain locations based on, for example, past uses, past storage of chemicals, different things that occurred at the power plant. We'll sample in those areas, and then based on what we find in those sample results, that may lead us to do additional sampling. So I just want to make sure that people understand the sampling results that we'll talk through tonight are the initial phase of sampling, and it's not the end of the sampling that we'll do. As I mentioned earlier, there's also a known petroleum release area on the property. It's sort of in the light green area, and Joe will talk about this in more detail as well. But the light green area, sort of on the top right part of the photograph, this was a release of fuel oil from underground storage tanks. The release was first discovered in 2013. The prior owner did implement remediation of the groundwater surrounding the underground storage tanks, but the tanks do remain in place. They've been closed, but they're closed in place. And because of sort of the physical constraints of the site at the time, the proximity to the existing power plant building, they weren't able to go in and remove those tanks or to do what we might call sort of direct source removal. So removal of the tanks and the impacted soil immediately around those tanks. But they did do groundwater remediation. That work did improve the groundwater quality, and we're now in a state where we're just monitoring the groundwater to make sure that conditions are stable and that there are no releases to the river, which is very nearby. As our demolition work proceeds and the building comes down, we will have access to that area and can go in and do more focused, what we would call source removal activities. And that's something that we'll plan to do as demolition proceeds. I'm going to hand it over to Joe, who can talk more about the results we have so far.
Thanks, Juliana. I'm Joe Jure. I'm the Vice President of Environmental Remediation for Hilco Redevelopment Partners. And as Juliana mentioned, I'm just going to go over the work that we've done so far in the voluntary remediation program, as well as the work related to the known petroleum release. We'll start with the voluntary remediation program and the characterization work that was completed last fall. I'll walk through those results, describe how we came up with the sampling plan and the areas to sample, what samples were collected, what we know based on the data that we've received, and what our next steps are. So the first slide here talks about the areas of interest. So these are the areas that we selected to implement sampling, and this is the subsurface sampling that Juliana was talking about, using a drill rig to sort of poke holes in the subsurface and collect samples of soil and groundwater. And these areas were identified based on a review of the site history as a former coal-fired power plant. And they are areas where historical activities sort of may have had the potential for environmental impacts, such as a release to the environment. So a few examples, and the ones that are listed on the slide. The known petroleum release area is shown in light green up along the waterfront. Thank you for pointing that out. And then there are a few sort of isolated former chemical storage and use areas throughout the site. These are areas where the chemicals that were used sort of in the daily operations of the power plant were stored or managed on site. Obviously, a major feature of the property is the building itself, that's shown in orange. And then the associated utility drain lines and outfalls are in yellow. These are actually features that are planned for a later phase of investigation, because it's difficult to access the subsurface under the building while the building is still standing. So after deconstruction, we'll do more focused investigation of the building and utility areas after the areas have been decommissioned and deconstructed. Then in dark green, in sort of the bottom right of the figure, we have the former coal and ash storage areas of the property. So there were several soil samples collected there to evaluate for the presence of chemicals that may be present as a result of the coal storage. So chemicals that are in the coal that may be present in residual nature after the coal has been removed. Then we have in red transformers and electrical equipment. And these are primarily of interest because this type of equipment often contains oil or other fluids that have the potential to be released to the environment. So it's important to investigate for those potential releases that may have occurred historically. And then finally, on the bottom of the screen along the property line, we have the rail yard, where we also did some soil sampling to evaluate for constituents that may be associated with fill material that was used to construct the rail, or things that were carried and transported by the railroad. Next slide. So as part of the process with the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality, VDEQ, we prepared, along with our consultant, Ramble, a work plan for the site characterization that identified the areas where we proposed to collect samples associated with these areas of interest that I just described. That work plan was submitted to the VDEQ in September of 2021, and then was subsequently approved by the VDEQ in October of 2020. Next slide. So this slide provides a kind of an overview of the sample locations. And you can see on the slide, there are some orange dots that represent soil locations where soil samples were collected. And then there are blue circles that show groundwater monitoring wells that were installed as part of the characterization program. And there are a few black circles on there, which are existing monitoring wells that were present previously as part of the monitoring of that known petroleum release. And so those were also sampled again as part of the characterization work that was being done to investigate these areas of interest. So in terms, go back to the previous slide. So in terms of the soil samples, there were total of 49 samples collected from 22 locations. And the chemicals for analysis were selected based on the site history. So different samples from different areas of the site were analyzed for different chemicals based on the historical activities for that particular area. So for example, the red areas with the electrical equipment and transformers were analyzed for constituents called polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs. These are constituents that were historically commonly used in transformer oil and would be suspected to be present in the subsurface if there was a release of that transformer oil historically. So again, not all samples were analyzed for all constituents. The samples were analyzed based on sort of the historical use of that area of the property. And similarly for groundwater, the groundwater monitoring wells, there were 9 new wells that were installed and 4 existing wells that were sampled. And those were analyzed for the same constituents as the soil samples, again, based on their location on site and the historical use of that portion of the site. Next slide. So to review the soil sampling results that we have so far, again, these are preliminary results, from our first round of what is an iterative sampling process. This gives us kind of the initial information to evaluate, areas that may require additional investigation to come to a more complete understanding and conclusion about the conditions. So as I go through this list of constituents, we've grouped the results on these slides by the type of constituent, and as an example, metals, petroleum hydrocarbons, et cetera. And we've just provided a summary of the results relative to VDEQ screening levels. And I'll just explain what those are. VDEQ establishes screening levels that are concentration thresholds. And what I mean by that is they identify the amount of chemicals that could be present at a site. And if chemicals are present above this particular amount that's identified by the screening level, it's just indicative of an area that may merit further investigation. to determine if remediation is warranted. So what we've done is we've identified the constituents that have been detected at concentrations greater than these screening levels on these few slides, as well as those constituents that were not detected at concentrations greater than screening levels. So the ones that were detected at concentrations greater than screening levels are ones that will sort of be carried forward and further evaluated. And the ones that were not detected at concentrations greater than screening levels are generally considered to be of less concern for the areas that have been sampled so far. So for metals, we detected thallium, iron, and manganese at concentrations greater than screening levels at a subset of the locations. Again, not at all locations, but at some particular locations on site. Petroleum hydrocarbons, concentrations in general at the site were less than the VDEQ action level or screening level. In the rail yard portion of the site in particular, there were a few samples that did have concentrations greater than those screening levels. And then the remaining constituents, PCBs, SVOCs, and VOCs, were generally not detected at concentrations greater than screening levels. And PCBs in particular were not detected above, were not detected at all at the property at levels that could be identified by the laboratory. Next slide. So that was the summary for soil. Now I'll go through the same sort of summary for groundwater and the groundwater samples that were collected. In groundwater, manganese was the only metal that was detected at concentrations greater than the VDEQ screening levels at a few locations. Petroleum hydrocarbons were generally site-wide less than the action levels, with the exception of the samples that were collected from the known petroleum release area, which is an area where we knew sort of going in based on the historical information that petroleum hydrocarbons were present. And similar to soil, PCBs were not detected, and SVOCs and VOCs were less than screening levels. So next steps, now that we have this initial data, what do we do now? So one of our immediate next steps is to submit a preliminary site characterization report to the VDEQ that summarizes in more detail the results that I just talked about and shares the information with the department. Then additional sampling will be conducted in the areas that are currently inaccessible. So again, as the building is deconstructed, we'll have greater access to areas of the site that are not currently accessible, and will complete similar types of sampling as have been completed to date in the areas as they become accessible. And the results from that sampling will be documented in another site characterization report. And then once we have complete information from this initial round of sampling, we'll perform what's called a human health risk assessment, which involves taking the data that has been collected and evaluating whether the amount of chemicals and the types of chemicals that are present pose a risk to future users of the site. And so that's a process that is used to identify areas where remediation is warranted. If the human health risk assessment indicates that remediation is warranted for specific chemicals in specific areas of the site, then remedial actions will be selected, designed, and implemented. And we anticipate that those activities would take place in coordination with the deconstruction and redevelopment of the property. And all of that would be done in coordination with the VDEQ under the voluntary remediation program. So early in the process here, and several steps to go, but we feel good about what's been completed so far. Next slide. So finally wanted to talk about the status of the known petroleum release area. And as Juliana mentioned, this is an area where there was a release from 2 underground storage tanks, a release of fuel oil to soil and groundwater in the subsurface. And the prior property owner did conduct remediation to address the groundwater contamination in this area. As a result of that remediation, the groundwater conditions improved. The remediation work was done under the oversight of the VDEQ petroleum program, as well as the DC District Department of Energy and Environment, DOEE, as they have jurisdiction over the river, which is obviously a receptor of concern for releases from this area. We want to make sure through remediation and monitoring that any impacts that have occurred in the groundwater do not migrate to the river. So as a result of the actions that were taken by the prior property owner, the groundwater conditions have improved and they've stabilized to the point where it's been demonstrated that there is no migration of the groundwater contamination to the river. And we are continuing to monitor the groundwater conditions twice per year in accordance with work plans that have been submitted to both the VDEQ petroleum program and the DC DOEE. And we submit status reports summarizing those sampling results to each of those agencies twice per year. The plan going forward for this area will be, as Juliana mentioned, in coordination with the deconstruction and redevelopment work as areas become accessible for more focused subsurface remediation to address the sources of fuel oil that resulted in the groundwater contamination. We will, as is feasible, conduct source removal to further mitigate any additional or future impacts to the environment. And then our intent would be to seek closure of this release area under the VDEQ petroleum program and with the DC DOE. That's it.
Thank you, Juliana and Joe. Evening, everyone. I'm Mike Babcock, Managing Partner of Sustainable Building Partners. We're a DC Metro region-based interdisciplinary firm that focuses on advancements in sustainable design and construction, energy performance engineering, commissioning, and other related activities. We're proud to be a partner on this project. And on a more personal note, as a resident of the city of Alexandria for a little over 16 years now, I'm excited to be able to work on this great project with this great project team on a new, exciting, sustainable neighborhood. And as we move into the next portion of our program, we're also transitioning from environmental remediation and site preparation, which will create a new canvas for a high-performance sustainable development. So as Juliana and Joe have outlined, all the work that's going into just getting the site ready for that next stage that everybody's really excited about. Next slide. So first off, I think it's important from a framework perspective. We talk about sustainability in terms of concepts and principles, but what does that mean for this site? What are some of the parameters with which we're working? We think it's important to outline the framework from which we're working from regarding sustainable performance, plan, policy, and outlook. These are some of the governing documents we're utilizing as recent and relevant reference point for some criteria and specific metrics we'll be using to define success from a sustainability perspective. And they are the Old Town North Small Area Plan, 2017, the Green Building Policy of 2019, and the Environmental Action Plan, which has an outlook to 2040, which was also developed in 2019. Looking to the recent, past, present, and future. So the first in order of published year and hierarchy is the Old Town North Small Area Plan. It's important to note that while the small area plan covers a lot of criteria for the development of this area, it does include crafting measures and metrics for sustainable performance, specifically in Section 3, Energy and Green Building, highlighted here. Some of the notes you'll see on to the right, lead in D silver. We're briefly going to touch on what that means in a few minutes here. a sustainability master plan, which looks to identify short, mid, and long-term strategies, similar to that of the architecture of the Environmental Action Plan report. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. A couple key points, which are new and emphasized areas of importance for the city and all of us, which are striving to achieve carbon neutrality by 2040 and buildings by 2030. And also the exploration of district-wide systems, which we're actively studying early in the development process to assess scale, opportunities, and whatnot. And then lastly, but certainly not least, the encouragement of on-site renewable energy to the extent possible while managing competing priorities for other sustainable elements. This helps to better define some of the primary objectives of the plan from a sustainability perspective and narrow our focus into areas that we can have impact. Next. The next item we're talking about is the Green Building Policy, which was developed in 2019. One of the primary drivers of the Green Building Policy is to achieve LEED Silver at minimum leadership in energy and environmental design at the building level. While we're still at the site, we are focused on the buildings as well. Plus these additional performance points within LEED or priority conditions as defined by the city within the LEED framework. That puts an extra emphasis on and focus on additional energy savings, renewable energy generation, indoor, outdoor potable water use, enhanced levels of building commissioning and performance, and thermal comfort. And you can start to see some overlapping themes between these different documents and how we establish goals and metrics and targets with which we're trying to reach. Okay, next slide. The last one is more the future. So we talked about the recent past, the present, and then the future. So the City of Alexandria has published a document, the EAP, Environmental Action Plan of 2040, which looks at those short, mid, and long-term goals from an environmental perspective from the City of Alexandria. It looks at goals across several impact categories. You can see them to the left. I think it's important also to recognize that sustainability touches everything we do. And in this document, along with the Sustainability Master Plan, which we'll be working on with the city, takes an equitable perspective on the ultimately delivered project. We're looking to manage competing priorities for open space, stormwater management, energy systems, wellness, and overall development quality. We want to make sure we find a solution that doesn't go too far in one area without addressing in a meaningful fashion other impact categories. For example, the image you see here is a snippet direct from the EAP relative to the city's inventory of greenhouse gas emissions from 2015. And as you can see from the pie chart, the identification in gray there is about 1/2 of the carbon footprint assessed by the city is tied to the built environment, commercial and residential buildings, which we are here today to discuss and strive towards reducing that direct impact. So one of the frameworks, a lot of those that are attending may know, others may not, an applicable and relevant framework that the city is using as well as private and public development is LEED. We recognize that frameworks for accountability are very important. We can talk about thresholds and goals, but accountability is also a big part of what we're after here. The USGBC's leadership in energy and environmental design is an excellent tool. It's rigorous third-party verification system, widely recognized across all areas of the building industry. This is one of the systems that holds us accountable to meeting very specific thresholds for sustainable performance. And as mentioned in the Old Town North Small Area Plan, the project will be pursuing LEED ND, which is an acronym for neighborhood development, which looks at sustainability at a neighborhood scale, focuses on additional criteria for performance not covered within individual building certification system. Some of these primary focus areas include smart location and linkage, which focuses on conservation, housing, jobs proximity, dwelling units per acre, habitat, landscape design, civic spaces, and other meaningful connection points. Neighborhood pattern and design, which establishes metrics to get folks engaged in the community. We're not creating a hermetically sealed environment, but how do we get people interacting with their environment? That includes walkability, safety, connection, mixed use opportunities, and education, those that both live, work, and play in this future development. And lastly, green infrastructure and buildings. That gets into building level performance, energy, water, and resources. So the combination of these systems really work to hold us accountable, but also give us targets that we want to hit. And I also think that this is also further reinforced in HRP's project vision outlined by Michelle earlier tonight. Also referenced in the 2019 Green Building Policy, the buildings will be committing to hit at minimum a LEED Silver level. And while it's early in the development process, as Melissa has indicated, and we've got meetings and we're going through designs, and we are currently putting our focus on site-wide strategies. We do, however, want to recognize that the buildings will be meeting overall performance goals as well when we get to that point. Slide. Carbon neutrality. I mentioned it in the Old Town North Small Area Plan. So far, we've talked about guidelines, frameworks, and accountability. So jumping right in, we want to talk about one of the focus points referenced in the Small Area Plan, striving for carbon neutrality. As a reference goal, we feel it's important to first define and orient ourselves around what exactly does that mean? And more specifically, how does it relate to the built environment? We're defining carbon neutrality as the goal to neutralize the life cycle carbon emissions associated with the design, construction, and operation of the project. The imagery here is really defined to help represent what that looks like and the specific touch points in the process, the full life cycle of where and how decisions that are made from design through material, system choices, construction, operation, ultimately deconstruction, impact the carbon position of the project, of any project really. And to that end, as Melissa mentioned earlier, the PRGS project is volunteering, proceeding with a comprehensive carbon neutrality analysis to better understand where the push points are, explore opportunities, assess market and technological conditions to achieving these goals, and identify relative impact potential at a site concept level. And we are currently working with the city on this activity. So now that we have a definition relative to the built environment, where do we start? And more importantly, how do we get there? Well, I think first, and maybe the obvious one is the carbon footprint historically of the site to where we're going. I think the first step, which has been done 2012, was the decommissioning of the coal plant that was located here. Through advocacy efforts of the city, its residents, businesses, the PRGS site was decommissioned in 2012. I think it's somewhat intuitive regarding the positive environmental effect this move has made, but we felt it is a good idea to recognize and celebrate what this impact is relative to carbon emissions and environmental benefit of the decommissioning of that plant, inclusive of long-term, far-reaching effects, more than just the direct impact to Alexandrians, but also definitely as a primary step in the drive towards cleaner sources of power and carbon neutrality. As we discussed earlier, the first step is to get the site ready for consumption, create a new, healthy, and viable canvas from which to work towards. Joe and Juliana outlined a lot of that work that's already underway. Deconstruction coming, more sampling, learning more about the site, and doing so in a mindful way, which allows us to create this new, vibrant, sustainable community. And we understand it's a very dynamic effort, inclusive of the deconstruction of those existing assets, identification areas of focus, human health risk assessment, which is right within HRP's wheelhouse. And I think you've seen that also evident in Bonnie's presentation regarding other developments that Hilco is working on. Okay. So the path to carbon neutrality, as we're calling it, where do we go from here? These are the primary focus areas when looking towards neutralizing the life cycle carbon of the project. This is certainly a simplified look at the overall picture and path forward, breaking down the carbon footprint into specific categories and design and construction decisions to yield maximum impact. First, operational carbon, energy efficiency, all day, every day. No real surprise here. And we're looking at whole building energy savings and exploring strategies that can move us towards higher performing facilities for a site that's going to be built out over time. Embodied carbon, which actually comes before the operational carbon in the general sequence of the built environment. This is the carbon from day one, the materiality of the project with a heightened focus around primary structural and enclosure solutions. This is a rapidly evolving industry as we speak, with new vigor, attention, and creativity for design and construction professionals applied to the materiality of the built environment, which can grab that carbon before it gets into the atmosphere. Electrification, this is a term a lot of you may have heard referenced in other presentations, but really what electrification is, it's the building's relationship to the utility grid and the goal to minimize on-site combustion sources and the associated Scope 1 greenhouse gas emissions from that direct combustion. And lastly, after we address conservation and efficiency, we focus on and off-site renewable energy sources. That includes what you see and what you might not see, which we're going to talk to in a minute. So what is the relative impact of each of these focus areas and how do you attack it? So what you're seeing here are the components that make up this waterfall chart as we've represented carbon neutrality. It represents as we build up from a starting position of 0, organized into primary categories for materials represented in the dark green bars, from structure and enclosure to energy, which is represented in the blue, which includes owner versus tenant/resident control, energy loads over the anticipated life of the project. A couple of key elements here are to identify owner-influenced energy and tenant-influenced energy. The effect relative to that tenant education, lighting, plugs, temperature set points, hot water usage, etc. There's a component of design where you can create an atmosphere to be successful. And then how is that energy used? How is that energy efficient system used? Do we have really good lights that are on all the time? Do we have a really efficient hot water system, but we're using a lot of water? So it's that balance and true understanding of how buildings use energy in today's marketplace. The right side of the dashed line represents the components mentioned in the previous slide, those elements of going after carbon neutrality. The graph demonstrates how we can best influence a realistic outcome, and the levers, those arrows representing that if we do a little bit more here, we trim up this area, do more on embodied carbon. It's the idea that through technology, what's available to us today, and then what's available to us through the life of the development of this project, that technology is going to change over time. We understand what the focus areas are. So as that technology evolves and as we get better, and we can apply those for the future development of this project. I also want to reinforce that this is a concept level study, given where we are in terms of design and overall planning. But with that being said, this analysis is intended to help guide decisions relative to carbon impact and apply appropriate emphasis on aspects of the design and construction of the project, looking to establish performance thresholds, goals, manage competing priorities, and optimize the building's relationship to the grid. The first one I mentioned, operational carbon, energy savings. Energy efficiency and coincident peak demand reductions are a primary component of reducing carbon emissions. We want to optimize the value of every unit of energy, right? Any unit of energy that hits the site, we really want to get the maximum value out of that. Reduces operational costs for tenants and ownership, emissions, increases life of equipment, et cetera. It's also important to note that base building systems and tenant controlled loads, for example, in a multifamily building, which includes energy efficient lighting, plug loads, appliances, ventilation, in-unit lighting, often represent over half of a building's operational energy, effectively the cost of doing business for a multifamily building. So looking to address the energy that we do have full control over, but what can we do from an education and how we use that energy to really have deep impact? There's an importance and an emphasis in addressing ventilation loads in commercial buildings and multifamily, and doing so in an energy efficient way through energy recovery, air volume management, outside air temperature control sequences, et cetera. The other key item is really promoting and pushing the advancements in scalable heat pump technology. You know, we're not talking about technology and equipment that you might apply to a single family house, but how do we apply scalable heat pumps for larger buildings, achieving operational carbon reductions, and also overlaps really well with electrification. And the last point on operational carbon, which is also covered in the small area plan, is district-wide strategies. So the project team is actively exploring this for technical and physical feasibility. These include centralized versus decentralized HVAC systems, potentially utilizing the ground and or river as a heat sink or source, for example, ground source heat pumps, and other hybrid approaches at a concept level. Joe mentioned some of the sampling that's going. We are looking at setting targets and goals and doing some preliminary engineering studies to understand what the potential is. Next slide. Embodied carbon, deeper dive into the materiality and structural solution, material efficiency, material choices, management, carbon reductions, and carbon sequestration strategies, environmental performance-based criteria. This is a relatively new energy and excitement in the industry. There's a lot of new focus, and this is also rapidly evolving. We're looking for deeper and deeper impacts with regards to those primary decisions that we make regarding solutions when we talk about the harvesting and extraction of materials to the manufacturing, transportation, installation through deconstruction, a full life cycle approach to materials cradle to grave. Our collective goal beyond just this project in this field is to address that yellow bar you see in the top right image, where it talks about going beyond business as usual without focusing on the buildings we're building and the embodied carbon associated with them. That's that flat yellow line. Our goal is to drive that down over time. Next. Electrification. The goal is to minimize, as I mentioned earlier, any on-site combustion and the associated site level emissions for the project. You'll also see in here, I mentioned the term appropriate electrification, which looks at the continued advancement of scalable heat pump based solutions for meeting primary based building space heating and water heating loads, especially in this market. We're not Southern California, we're not the Northeast, we're not where it's really dry. We're in a climate that's very cold, very hot, very humid, and we can see temperature swings 30, 40 degrees in a day. So it's an interesting challenge in our climate zone to be able to meet those loads with technologies that are out there and that are currently being deployed real time. Another thing I think is interesting when we talk about electrification is the service for the Virginia and Carolina. That's the graph you see there of the United States. Well, the way it works in the utility world is it's broken into specific grids. And in actually the grid that serves this community is the 6th cleanest grid in the country. And you can see the reduction in emissions per unit of electrical energy delivered over the last couple of years, which is consistent with the goals of the Virginia Clean Energy Economy or Virginia Clean Economy Act. And more specifically, you can see the published gains over the last 3 years representing a 16% reduction for this grid for every kilowatt hour produced, which is really exciting. It also further reinforces the importance of a continued push for cleaner sources of power. The last point I want to make on electrification, and again, I mentioned our climate zone because different solutions are all regionally based, is to minimize electric resistance-based heating to the extent we can. Electric resistance is extremely inefficient, and it's important from an energy efficiency consideration. Okay. On-site renewable energy, what you see. On-site renewable energy is a direct and immediate response to energy generation, directly at the source of demand for that energy prior to engaging the utility. The interesting component and often the challenge with on-site renewable is managing competing priorities. As we look to build resilient communities, we have to maximize the utilization of our roof areas, as well as looking at things like green roof, the image where you can see that the green and solar is integrated, open space, and other elements. The other interesting thing, I think, anecdotally, with regards to solar technology, there continues to be advancements in terms of output efficiency with real significant gains relatively recently. We saw very moderate gains in solar performance efficiency from about 1960 to 2012. So the first 50 years of solar, we got from 14% efficient to 18% efficient. Now that we have a heightened focus around this, we have seen a significant uptick from about 18% to 23% in just 3 years, with more significant and exciting prototype level technology advancements that are pushing PV efficiency to 35+% efficient. So as we create environments for solar, as that technology advances, it will continue to have deeper impacts. And with that said, we do recognize that there are limiting factors to how much on-site renewable energy generation can be offset in urban environments where you're really utilizing that land in an effective way with limited roof space, carve out areas, that sort of thing relative to your footprint. Okay. Off-site renewable energy. This is what you don't see. Why electrify? This is why. Utility scale off-site renewable energy. As the grid is cleaned up and buildings are electrified appropriately, electric cars, all of these sorts of things, we're making a major step towards neutrality. I mentioned the building's relationship to the grid, but also the concept of grid interactive buildings, peak load shedding and management to best manage the increase in coincident demand for electricity to help reinforce a clean, resilient grid. It's also important, and this might be not as intuitive, to note that new development actually spurs the opportunity for new utility scale renewable energy generation. Shown in the image here are two Virginia-based utility scale renewable energy systems. The solar is a 120 megawatt solar array as part of Amazon's solar farm located in Virginia. It's about 367,000 solar panels. Overall, Virginia is over 1,400 megawatts of capacity in the Commonwealth, with more coming. There's new third-party pilot programs established by the Virginia State Corporation Commission through Dominion Power, and there's also other avenues. Further advancements, I think, are important in small-scale power purchase agreements for renewable energy. Those agreements can be very complex contracts, and I think over time that'll get simplified and make clean power available to all of us. Next slide. So up to this point, we've been heavily reviewing site prep, carbon impact. However, sustainable neighborhoods and buildings go much further than just carbon and are inclusive of multiple impacts. As Melissa mentioned earlier, we'll be developing a sustainability master plan that will run in parallel to the infrastructure DSUP, which will be submitted later this spring, which looks at, again, short, mid, long-term goals, setting targets, and measures to achieve both. There's going to be some aspirational and realistic options. We understand that we are looking at a plan that works both today and evolves as the project is built over time. Next slide. So sustainability is intended to permeate throughout the development and can be expressed in many ways, some of which you might see, others are behind the scenes. And we're in the progress of establishing some preliminary goals that work to address some of the key items you see here. which I think reinforce an equitable look at a sustainable, vibrant, new community development. Thank you. And with that, turn it back to Mary Catherine. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Joanna. We wanted to end tonight by reminding you how you can continue to engage with HRP and the city in this process in the coming months. We went through the previous meetings, and that pink dot is where we are tonight. As we've discussed earlier, we'll have our next community meeting on March 31st on transportation. We'll be posting logistical information on that meeting as we get closer to the date. We'll also be submitting the next CDD concept plan submission called a completeness submission to the city before the end of the month. All of these submissions and topical meetings are moving us towards public hearings on the CDD concept plan in late June and early July of this year. So we still have plenty of time to work together as we transform the unsightly power plant site into a vibrant mixed-use community that weaves into the fabric of Old Town North. Now, we look forward to answering your questions as best as we can. Remember, you can either ask questions in writing or verbally, and we'll be going back and forth from written questions to verbal questions as we move forward to give people the opportunity to ask their questions. We're going to start with a question that was emailed to us actually right before the meeting, and it says, two questions. Is Hilco still planning a 50 to 65 foot art structure? And so I'm going to turn that over to Melissa because that was our first question.
Art structure? No, I don't think that's what we're planning. They might be confused that we have some arts uses on the site that we are planning throughout the site, and those would be primarily on ground floors of buildings. I would imagine that we would also expect to see some public art throughout the open spaces, but that 50 or 60 feet might be a little tall for that. But there is a building at Block A that is anticipated to house an arts use. We don't know what that user may be yet, but that's a multi-story building that I believe is up to 70 feet in height on the Block A. And I don't expect that the arts use would necessarily take up all of the floors that would be in a building of that height. So there might be either commercial product or commercial space or residential space above that.
Thanks. Well, so far we don't have any hands raised, so I'm going to go to the written questions. And a number of them have to do with the environmental remediation and site prep that we discussed earlier. What is the difference between a VDEQ screening level and an industrial screening level? Joanna or Joe, can I turn that over to you?
Thanks, Mary Catherine. Yes, that's a great question. So the VDEQ has two sets of screening levels. So a set of screening levels for residential use and a set of screening levels for industrial use or commercial use. So these are risk-based concentrations, and so they're calculated assuming different types of contact with soil or groundwater, for example. So there are a couple places on the slides where we indicated the concentrations were below one or the other of those screening levels. So that's the difference between the two. So they're both sets are VDEQ screening levels, and just depending on the assumed current or future use. At this site, where sort of currently or in its past life, it would have been an industrial use, that would have been the appropriate set of screening levels. Currently, that might still be appropriate, but we'll look at the residential screening levels as well in our evaluations, anticipating the potential future use of the site.
Thank you. All right, we have a hand raised, Mark Payne. Mr. Payne?
Mark, we have unmuted you from our side.
There's a little bit of interference, I think, in your audio. Can you try again?
I said, are y'all going to use rail at your facility?
Are we going to be using the existing rail line for the facility? Is that your question?
Yes.
Okay. Melissa, do you want to answer that one?
Sure. That's a Norfolk Southern rail line. It has been discontinued. It's no longer used. I believe it has no longer been used at least since the power plant has been shut down. So about 10 years ago. And we are in the process of actually removing some of the rail lines that are inside of our property so that we can continue with the sampling that Juliana and Joe spoke about. So no, we don't have an intention to use rail at the site.
Thanks, Melissa. Okay. Next question in writing. Is the site characterization report a public document? And if so, where can we access it? Thanks. Juliana or Joe?
Hi. Yes, the site characterization report, when it's finalized, will be a public record document. It'll be submitted to VBEQ, and we can also make it available on our website for anyone who cares to read it. I will warn it will be a very technically written document, but we're certainly happy to answer any questions anyone may have about it.
Thanks, Juliana. We're going to continue with some of those written questions until we get some more hands up. The next one is, Mr. Jure said the sample levels were not above industrial screening levels. Are the acceptable levels, and I think Juliana, this goes to sort of what you answered before, are the acceptable levels different for areas that are intended for commercial or residential? If so, does this alter the extent of the remediation?
Great question. Yes, so there's two different sets of screening levels. Industrial and commercial would fall into a similar, would both sort of fall into the industrial, or sort of its non-residential might be an easier way to think about it. And it really has to do with the duration of time that people spend on a property. So both screening levels will consider for this site, which is considering the change in use. Again, the screening levels are used to identify areas where additional evaluation is needed. So I just want to be clear on that. A screening level does not indicate a problem on its own, but it's a level that says, this is something we need to look at more closely. So they'll both be considered. And then that human health risk assessment process that Joe talked about will consider the future planned use of the site. And yes, typically a residential site, I'm going to say typically because it's going to depend on the specific contaminants, but typically a residential use might require a larger remediation than an industrial or commercial use.
Thanks. Okay, we have another question from Mr. Payne. Mr. Payne, do you want to ask your question? You'll have to unmute yourself. There you go.
Yes, hello again. Thanks again, group. I have an idea for you. You should make a pier for a ferry to transport people to the apartments. That'd be a great idea.
Yeah, no, appreciate the suggestion, Mark. We are in agreement. We have definitely been talking with the city about the opportunity for water-based transportation here. To be clear, we don't own the waterfront area. That's actually controlled by the National Park Service, where the Mount Vernon Trail goes through. But HRP, the city, and the National Park Service have been coordinating now over the last several months to talk about a variety of different improvements that could come out of the project as we redevelop the PRGS site, and that we're obviously adjacent to the National Park Service land, and what could we do to help them on that side of the property line and create a cohesive, holistic, public open space, and how can we work together to activate the waterfront more as well. So those are definitely things that we're talking about. We would have because we don't own the water frontage, and we don't own the water sheet. We would obviously need National Park Service's approval to do something like that. There are also some approval and jurisdictional hurdles to get through to get something like a dock built out on the water of the Potomac, but those are not things that we're afraid of trying. And so we are definitely thinking about how we could get some additional waterfront activation, including water-based transportation that might be like a form of a water taxi, that would go down to the other stops in central Old Town, and then also over to the district and maybe other areas as well.
Thanks, Melissa. Okay, we'll go back to the questions. What will be done to monitor airborne PCBs and notify people living near the site? Juliana or Joe, do you want to try that one?
Sure, thanks, Mary Catherine. So I want to follow up on the sampling results that we have so far, where we have sampled for PCBs and we have not detected PCBs. So I want to make sure that's really clear. We have not detected PCBs in soil or groundwater so far. As we talked about before, we're not done with sampling, and we will continue to sample for PCBs in areas where it's appropriate. But so far, we have not detected PCBs. So just to address this question, this airborne exposure to PCBs is not an exposure that we expect is relevant at this site. If that changes, we will certainly let people know, and those results will be shared in our sampling reports. Another thing I'll just add about airborne exposure to PCBs are relatively heavy chemicals. So the air phase is not their sort of typical place to be. Airborne exposure to PCBs can occur at significantly contaminated sites that are significantly contaminated with PCBs. So Superfund sites where PCBs were either manufactured or used in high quantities, which is not the situation at this site. So it is, I don't want to minimize the exposure. It can occur in certain instances where certain conditions are present. There are some lighter PCBs that can be present in the air phase, but it is not a condition that is expected at this site. And based on the data that we have so far, we just simply have not detected PCBs in the soil or groundwater, which would be the source of the PCBs to the air.
I have to remember to unmute my own self. Thanks, Juliana. We have a question from Margaret Townsend. Margaret, you're gonna have to unmute yourself.
Yep. Quick question. When you all were discussing the water taxi idea and the fact that you do not own that watershed, and I believe I've mentioned this before, have you reached out to the Marine Department of Transportation? They're trying to put together that barge system. Amanda Rutherford is the contact for that. That might give you increased access to the waterfront. And if you are interested, I'm more than happy to put you in touch with Amanda.
We have spoken. You're talking about MARAD, right?
Yes.
We have
absolutely.
spoken with Amanda, and they do offer programs that are related to transportation of goods, not so much transportation of humans.
Yes.
But it's definitely a possible. I think Margaret, candidly, first we have to proceed to see if we can get some kind of boating activity out there, whatever it may be, water taxi, kayak, those sorts of things, before we can really determine the I guess what that those craft would be carrying. So I'm not sure we're quite yet to the stage where we could really engage with MARAD in a meaningful way, since there are a number of other conversations that we need to have about the possibility of actually building something like that there.
Sure. And you would need to make sure, of course, that the kayaks and the recreational boaters and the transportation facilities are not impacting on one another. Of course, we don't want
100%.
barges running into kayaks, shall we say?
Exactly.
Thanks, Margaret. Okay, let's go to the next question in writing. Is deconstruction also part of how you're defining carbon neutrality in this case?
I'll take that one. That's a great question. Very interesting. I think that, and I see Mike turn on his screen. I'll see if my answer is the same as his. I think that there's a relationship there, absolutely, especially as it relates to embodied carbon, which was the second aspect that Mike was talking about as we strive towards carbon neutrality. And embodied carbon in the sense of, when you're taking something like this facility down, there may be materials that can be reused. So that's something that Hilco looks to do on all of our sites where it's possible. If we have clean concrete that's available on the site that could be crushed and used as backfill in foundation design and construction, we'll look at that. And that way we're not having to export all the material and then bring in other new material later. And we're conserving energy on multiple fronts there, right? Like not having to remake the carbon, not having to dispose of the carbon, or concrete rather, not having to transport either one way out and another way back in. So we do look at things like that. And I would say that that's an aspect of deconstruction that is, but it participates in the goal of carbon neutrality. Mike, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Melissa, that's spot on. Whenever you come into a position where you have existing assets, right, you want to assess what you can use in a creative way from a historical perspective, from a creative perspective, but there's a lot of energy that goes into the creation of any material, right? And if there are elements, and again, knowing that, a lot of it could be contaminated and whatnot, and doing that inventory of what can be reused in a creative way always provides value from an embodied carbon perspective, let alone some of the more base level materials Melissa mentioned regarding being able to reuse concrete, for example, because that's a very energy intensive material. You got to melt that limestone. So anything you can do there is always impactful. But I think Melissa hit it on the head right there.
All right, thanks. We have another question verbally from Mr. Payne. Mr. Payne, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yes. Can you hear me real good?
We can.
Yep.
All right. On your crushed concrete, also your the old ash from the coal that burned, y'all could sell that and make money, by the way.
Well, there's no fly ash at the facility today. I don't believe that we know of. The fly ash was not stored on the site. It was trucked off of the site throughout its operation.
I thought it was, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I thought it was still there because you did samples of it. That's why I was saying to dig that up and resell it or use it for highways. Or if you're for your asphalt roads at your facility.
Yeah, I can speak to that a little, Melissa, if that would help why we sampled in those areas. That's absolutely correct that fly ash is used in those purposes. But as Melissa mentioned, the fly ash that was historically present on the site was all transported off-site, either for reuse or disposal prior to our ownership. The reason we did sample in those areas where ash would have been stored or where coal, the original coal prior to its burning would have been stored is that there's the potential of just the storage of those materials to have impacted the underlying soil and groundwater. So we did sample the underlying soil and groundwater to understand whether the storage of those materials did impact the environment, but the ash itself is no longer present on the site.
Okay. Thanks again. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we'll go to a written question. So love seeing that carbon neutrality definition includes embodied carbon. Could you speak to further plans for reducing embodied carbon?
Yes, I share your enthusiasm. There is a lot of creative construction methods and solutions out there. Every day there's more and more performance-based environmental product declarations for the non-traditional stuff, not just the materials on the interior of the building, but also the primary structural materials. And because the industry and market is moving that way, cement manufacturers, steel, everybody's really pushing to the point where they're trying to make their own facilities even more efficient. There's strategies regardless of whether you're concrete, where you look at curing time, carbon sequestration actually can make the material stronger, steel hybrid solutions. mass timber and sourcing, and and all of this is rapidly evolving. And codes are actually evolving too for some of these more impactful embodied carbon. And it is something that is literally changing by the minute in our industry, because as a collective group, we have put emphasis behind this. And every day there's more available to us, whether it's material management, choice, procurement, where it comes from, sourcing. It's not just you go and you buy it. Now we're digging in deeper to the whole process of that material.
Thanks, Mike.
Mhm.
Okay, we have two questions that go together. I think there was just a little bit of a glitch so that the question continued in the next one. Several meetings ago, you asked the audience to respond to a survey asking them how they would like to use the waterfront, active, passive, that sort of thing. What were the results, or are you sharing those results? Melissa, do you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. That was our open space meeting that we did. I think it was November 29th, if my memory serves, my aging memory. Yes, we will be sharing those results. I think we did this survey at the meeting, and then we posted it on our website and left it open for about 2 weeks after that meeting. I think we got over 200, maybe up to 250 responses, which was very interesting. And was great to see that level of participation. We're going to be having a wrap-up meeting that we talked about, that Mary Catherine talked about when she went through the schedule in April, and I will share the results of the survey in that wrap-up meeting. And I also think we'll continue to do those kinds of surveys as we continue to move through the process and move into the infrastructure DSUP in the first phase DSUP. I think it's a great way to get people's input.
Thanks. I think I would also say that we have been to the Parks and Rec Commission, and at that Parks and Rec Commission, we actually went over the initial results that we had seen, and so that was really a good opportunity to continue the discussion about open space. We actually have a question. It's relatively long, and somebody asked that we read it completely so that there's context with regard to access to the waterfront. We regularly walk along the Mount Vernon Trail, which forms the eastern border of the power plant site. At the southeast corner of the site, the trail is roughly 30 feet above the level of the Potomac River. At the bridge in front of the pumping station, it's about 10 feet above the river. The trail rises then to 20 or 30 feet above the river to the northeast corner of the site. The strip of land between the trail and the river is quite steep. Assume for purposes of this question that Hilco gains the cooperation of the Park Service. What does Hilco envision for the riverfront? Other than a view of the river, what does Hilco envision with respect to residents interacting with the riverfront and the river? Melissa, we also have Ryan Ort with us from OJB. If we want him to answer that question, do you want to start?
Yeah, maybe I'll start and Ryan can jump in. That's a great question. I think if you didn't have the opportunity to join our open space meeting on November 29th, I would definitely invite folks to look at that presentation, which is available on our website here, which is HRP ALX.com, visible on this slide, but there's also the recording of the presentation as well. So you can hear the full presentation from Simon Beer from OJB, our landscape architect. Definitely that portion of the Mount Vernon Trail that wraps the pump house there that's in the chain link fenced area is very, very challenging. And the questioner is correct. There's a big sectional difference, but we're working with the National Park Service to think of ways that we can improve that section. And I can just tell you, it will be much more open. The cage will be coming down, which was really there to prevent people from getting into the power plants, right, from the pathway. And so I think it'll be a much more integrated type of environment there. And additionally, in terms of other activation on the waterfront, we talked a little bit earlier about potentially a dock for a water taxi. We also are thinking about potentially a kayak launch and where that could be located a little bit like further down the path. There's a variety of programmed elements that are being considered, whether it's kind of in areas that are more passive, where you might have like a woodland walk type boardwalk type of experience, and seating where you can have like contemplative and reflective moments, to more active areas like in front of a potential dock or kayak launch. There are overlooks that we have thought about, because there are some points that are higher and you get a really great view of the river. Some of the improvements that we've proposed to the National Park Service would include removing some of the invasive species that are there and solidifying the banks of the river as well to harden them a bit and make them sturdier. So there's a variety, I would say a wide range. Ryan, I probably took everything you were going to say, but if you want to add something, please do. I would say there's just a wide range of both physical and programmatic improvements that we're considering.
Ryan?
Yeah, I think you've hit every point that I was going to make. So I think
Sorry,
we're good on
Ryan.
that.
Okay, I did have one that I wanted to answer. I should have done it earlier, because it's where this presentation is going to be posted for viewing later. And so our website is www.hrpalx.com. So that's where it can be. That's where it can be posted. And then another question that we had is, what is the maximum height approved for new buildings closest to the water? And just, I want to reiterate, nothing's been approved yet, because the CDD concept plan has been submitted. That's part of this process, but for what is being requested, Melissa, do you want to take that one on max height?
Yeah, I think the highest height is up to 172 feet, but to be very, very clear, nothing is close to the water. There are no buildings that are close to the water. I don't know if we want to flip back through the slides back to the open space slide. I think is probably the best one that Michelle spoke to show the plan. One of the things to understand is that we don't own the waterfront area. That's the National Park Service land. And number two, that there's a resource protection area, or RPA line, that you've probably heard us talk about if you've attended some of our other meetings, that effectively forces development to sit a certain distance, in this case over 100 feet at least, back from the water's edge. So that really creates space so that the waterfront can remain open for people to enjoy. So and again, these are blocks, they're not buildings. There will be buildings developed on each one of these blocks, so they will get broken up. There'll be buildings of varying heights there, and none of them are really sitting on the waterfront.
Thanks, Melissa. I did want to, we should also note that the city posts our materials on their website as well. And Richard Lawrence indicated that the city will also post this presentation on their page of their website as well. So we have a verbal question from an Alyssa Bowler. Ms. Bowler, you'd have to unmute yourself.
So, hi, I'm an owner of Marina Towers. I live currently in Berlin, and I left Marina Towers in 1998. I live in Berlin, and I wanted to ask if I am at risk that my tenants could sue me because the guy's litigious. He's been difficult. And I want to know if I have any risk to be sued because he moved into an area that is at toxic risk.
Ms. Bowler, I'm not sure that we're the best people to answer that for you. What I can say is that if he moved in there in 1998, then that means
no, he moved in 2020 last year, and I've had nothing but problems. So I'm just a little bit worried, you know, that all of a sudden, sorry, maybe this is not appropriate for your webinar, but
that's okay.
Because I'm learning about all of the possible you know, substances that could be leaking or groundwater, da, da, da. Yeah, just wondered if there's any problem there.
Well, I'll reiterate, and I can see Juliana turn on her camera. I'll reiterate what I said earlier, which is that as we move into deconstruction, we'll be communicating in more detail about what that process is going to look like. To be clear, we go through an extensive abatement process to remove hazardous materials before the facility will be demolished, and we'll be following like all of the regulatory protocols for anything that will be removed of or disposed of from the site. And Juliana, you might want to add
Sure.
to
Thanks,
that.
Melissa. Alyssa, thanks for your question. When we certainly can't speak to hypothetically whether someone would sue someone or not, but what I can say is that the results that we have so far for soil and groundwater show really not significant impacts outside of that petroleum impacted area that we discussed, and that there would be no exposure to anybody who is not physically on the property. Even for people physically on the property, there would be no exposure unless you were, digging a hole down into this petroleum contaminated area. So yes, that's the information we have.
Okay,
Juliana.
thank you. Sorry to
Thanks,
be,
Melissa.
No, not at all.
No
Sorry
problem.
that you're
Don't
having challenges.
Don't apologize. Okay. That is actually our last question, and we have no other questions in the question and answer boxes. We actually are a little bit over our time. This is a really complex series of topics that we wanted to make sure we covered in great detail with you, and I think that it's been really a good discussion and good comments that we've gotten from the community. There's a lot of information that was shared, and we appreciate you taking all of the time to help us or work through comprehending all of these topics. So as I said, our next meeting is on March 31st with regard to transportation. And so we hopefully will be seeing some of you at that meeting. And as I said, logistics for that meeting will be released as we get a little bit closer. So thank you again to everyone. And here we go, keeping on. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.